Snow pressed against the small log cabin like a living thing, whispering against the shutters and rattling loose shingles in the black night. Inside, the fire held on in its narrow stone hearth, throwing gold light that trembled on the rough-hewn walls. Martha Whitlow, 50 years old and white-haired long before her years should have demanded it, sat with her needle and thread in hand. The cloth rested against her knees, but her eyes strayed often to the frost-laced window, where no view could be found beyond her own faint reflection. She worked not because it was needed, but because silence gnawed at her if her hands were still. Her cabin smelled of wood smoke, faint stew broth, and wool drying by the fire. Every item bore the wear of years, the kind of wear that comes not from family bustling through, but from one set of hands, alone, again and again. She had known solitude so long that the creak of her own chair startled her. Sometimes, she whispered aloud, just to remind herself she still had a voice. The town called her the spinster in the hills, and though she told herself she did not care, their words clung like burrs to her memory. She had been young once, with black hair and eyes quick with laughter. Suitors came, and suitors went. She had been stubborn, proud, waiting for someone who would not see her as convenience but as home. Waiting too long, perhaps. When her parents passed and her siblings scattered westward, she remained, her hair turning white in the span of harsh winters and harder gossip. By now she was a figure wrapped in rumor. Children dared each other to run past her gate. Men smirked when she came down for supplies, whispering that she had outlived use. And yet she endured. The night pressed colder. Martha set aside her mending and stirred the pot on the hearth, though she had little appetite. A single rabbit boiled with turnip, its broth stretched with hope more than substance. She ladled it into a tin bowl, hands steady from long habit. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a sound both mournful and familiar. She thought, as she often did, of how death might come quietly one night, her heart stopping while the snow fell, her body found months later when thaw allowed. It frightened her less than it used to. What chilled her now was the thought that no one would notice her absence. A sudden sound cracked through her thoughts, a knock at the door. Not the groan of wood nor the sigh of wind, but a hand, firm, insistent. Martha froze, the spoon hovering above her bowl. Visitors did not come in such storms, and no one, not in all her years, had ever arrived uninvited after sundown. She felt her chest squeeze, a mix of fear and strange hope. The knock came again, louder. Her mind spun through dangers, drifters, bandits, those who might take advantage of a woman alone. She nearly stayed still, praying silence would drive them off. But she remembered too many winter mornings when she herself nearly succumbed to cold, and she could not turn from the possibility of life and need. Setting her bowl aside, she moved to the door, her body stiff, her breath sharp in her chest. She lifted the wooden bar with trembling hands. The door swung wide, letting in a gust of snow and night air so bitter it stole her breath. There stood a man, broad-shouldered, shirtless despite the storm, his dark skin glistening with snowflakes, long black hair whipped by the wind. His eyes, black as obsidian, held no plea, only steady endurance. In his arms he carried a woman, younger, her face pale but beautiful, framed by hair the color of raven feathers. She was wrapped in a rough blanket, yet beneath it her rounded belly showed the truth. She was heavy with child. "Please," the man said, his voice deep but quiet, the word thick with accent yet clear enough. He shifted the woman gently in his arms, his expression carved of stone but softened by worry. Martha's heart pounded. An Apache. Every story the town had whispered rose like smoke. Savages, raiders, blood spilled in the night. To shelter them would mark her as a traitor in the eyes of neighbors who already despised her. And yet as she stared it was not the specter of war she saw but the trembling lips of the young woman, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, the way the man angled his body against the storm as if he could shield her from it. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of falling snow. Martha's mind screamed of danger, but her heart whispered of the stew on the hearth, of the warmth within her cabin, of the years she herself had longed for a knock on the door that meant she was not alone in this world. She stepped back, her voice rough from disuse. "Come in," she said. The man hesitated only a moment, then bent low and carried his wife across the threshold. The door closed behind them, muting the storm. Firelight washed over their figures. The young woman clutched at her belly, her breath shallow, while the man's chest rose and fell like a forge bellows. Snow melted into rivulets down his arms. Martha's cabin suddenly felt smaller, warmer, filled with presences that unsettled and stirred her in equal measure. She pulled a stool close to the fire and motioned. The man eased his wife down, his movements tender, reverent. His silence carried weight enough to speak. She was his world, and he had carried her through storm and distance to this fragile circle of firelight. Martha found herself moving without thought, grabbing another blanket, ladling stew into a bowl, setting it near the woman's hands. Her own hands shook, the bowl clattering slightly. Shame burned her cheeks, she felt clumsy, foolish. But when the young woman raised her eyes, they were soft with gratitude. She whispered something in Apache, her voice a fragile song, then pressed a hand over her belly and nodded. Martha could not understand the words, but she felt their meaning. "Thank you." For a moment, Martha forgot the gossip, the years, the ache of loneliness. She saw only two souls on the edge of survival, and herself as the thin bridge between life and the snow outside. Yet even as warmth spread through her cabin, dread coiled in her chest. She knew the sheriff patrolled the edges of these hills. She knew the eyes of town never missed a chance to whisper. If word spread that Martha Whitlow had sheltered an Apache warrior and his wife, her isolation would twist into condemnation. She would not only be alone, she would be branded. The fire popped, and the storm raged against the walls, but in the silence between, Martha heard the echo of her own choice. She had opened her door. She had stepped across a line from which there was no return. And as she glanced at the man seated by her fire, his obsidian gaze fixed on hers as if measuring the weight of her soul, she felt a shiver run through her body, not from the cold outside, but from the knowledge that this night had already changed everything. The fire spoke in crackles, throwing shadows against the walls that seemed alive with the weight of unspoken words. Martha moved slowly, careful not to startle her guests or herself, for every step reminded her that she had crossed into dangerous ground. The Apache man sat close to the hearth, the snow melting from his broad shoulders into rivulets that darkened the wood floor. His wife leaned into the blanket Martha had draped around her, spooning broth with trembling hands. The young woman's belly pressed outward beneath the fabric, the rounded swell of near birth. Martha could not look at it long without feeling the ghost of her own empty years, seasons when she might have carried, but never did. The silence was heavy, not hostile but cautious, like the hush of the woods before a storm breaks. Martha could feel the man's gaze following her as she moved about the cabin. His eyes were not threatening, but they were sharp, measuring, as though he needed to know if the woman who had opened her door could be trusted. She caught her reflection in the iron kettle, and startled at the streaks of white hair hanging loose across her temples, the thinness of her cheeks. What did he see when he looked at her? A savior? A risk? A lonely fool? At last the young woman set the empty bowl aside, whispering something in Apache. Her husband shifted, translated in halting English, his voice thick and low. "She thanks you. Says warmth keeps her child safe." His words were spare, but the weight in them was immense, as though gratitude cost him dearly. Martha nodded, unsure how to reply. "There's little here," she said. "But what there is you may have." Her voice cracked, dry from disuse. The man inclined his head, nothing more. She busied herself with small tasks, straightening the blankets near the cot, adding wood to the fire, pretending she did not feel their presence filling every corner of her home. The cabin had been hers alone for decades. Now, in a single hour, it breathed with life again. She could hear Chenoa's gentle hum, a lullaby in a tongue Martha could not understand. The sound sent an ache into her chest, like an old wound stirred by memory. When she glanced again at the young woman, she found her studying Martha with eyes dark as river stones. Chenoa's gaze held neither suspicion nor pity, but something softer, a recognition perhaps. Martha turned away quickly, ashamed, though she could not name of what. The man, Taza she guessed, for she thought she heard his wife whisper that name, rose at one point and walked to the window. His silhouette cut against the pale frost, tall and motionless. He did not speak, but the way he stood, broad shoulders squared against the storm outside, made Martha's cabin feel less like a fragile outpost, and more like a defended place. She realized with a pang of unease how quickly she had grown accustomed to his presence, how a sliver of safety crept into her bones with him near. She sat across from them, folding her hands in her lap to still their tremor. "The town!" She paused, tasting the risk. "The town won't take kindly to knowing I've opened my door." Taza's eyes turned toward her, steady, unreadable. He did not answer. He did not need to. She knew he understood. For a while, only the storm spoke. The snow hissed and rattled against the shutters, and the fire flared. Martha's thoughts roamed back to whispers she had endured for years. Men had smirked when her hair went white too early. Women had nudged each other when she passed, muttering of her strangeness, her stubborn solitude. Even children, bold in cruelty, had pointed and laughed. She had borne it, telling herself that pride was armor enough. Yet tonight, with these two souls beneath her roof, she felt the sting of shame more sharply, because now her choices did not touch only her. She rose to fetch more water from the barrel, but before she could, Chenoa lifted her hand, slender and graceful despite weariness. In broken English, softer than snow melting on a roof, she said, "Sit. You tired?" Her accent was heavy, her voice lilting. Martha froze, bowl in hand. It had been years since anyone told her to rest, to care for herself. The words, simple and imperfect, struck her like a kindness too rare to bear. She sat, slowly, her throat tightening. Chenoa leaned back, humming again to her child, and Taza adjusted the blanket around her shoulders with reverent hands. Martha could not look away. There was tenderness there, silent, sure, unyielding. She realized she had not seen such devotion in her life, not once, not even in youth when men courted her. It was like witnessing a language she had never learned but desperately wished to speak. As the hours deepened, the cabin filled with the rhythm of survival. Martha added logs to the fire. Taza checked the door latch and scanned the window, as if danger might claw through the snow. Chenoa drifted into shallow sleep, her hand resting over her stomach, murmuring softly even in dreams. Martha felt the pull of memory, of the girl she once was, waiting for someone who might see her as more than her hair, her face, her quietness. That girl had grown into a woman hardened by gossip and silence. Yet as she watched her guests breathe in the glow of her fire, she felt an unfamiliar stirring. Not joy exactly, but a loosening, as though loneliness no longer bound every corner of her being. Still, fear lurked. She knew what dawn could bring. The sheriff made rounds. The townsfolk hungered for scandal like wolves for meat. If they discovered Apache blood warming itself beneath her roof, the whispers about Martha would harden into stones. And stones had a way of being thrown. The fire spat a shower of sparks, startling her. Taza's gaze met hers across the flames. For an instant, she thought she saw something more than vigilance in his eyes. Something that measured not just her willingness to shelter them, but her strength to endure what would come. The weight of that silent question pressed upon her heart. Martha turned to the window. The snow had thickened, burying the world in white silence. She pressed her hand against the cold pane, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, two strangers rested in the warmth of her home, one carrying new life, the other carrying the silence of a protector. She stood between them and the judgment of the town, and she knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that would follow if word spread. The thought should have made her retreat into fear, but instead a strange calm settled over her. For the first time in years, her cabin did not feel like a tomb. It felt like a place where choices mattered. And yet beneath that calm, the whisper of dread remained. Dawn would come, and with it eyes that would not forgive what she had done tonight. Morning broke muted, the storm easing into a hush that draped the hills in deep white silence. Martha stepped outside with a bucket, her boots sinking into snow that swallowed her ankles, her breath clouding the still air. The world glowed pale, soft as a shroud, but peace did not settle her. She knew dawn carried eyes sharper than knives. Smoke curling from her chimney would be noted. Strangers had left tracks in the snow, heavy and undeniable. Every mark felt like a confession pressed into the earth. When she returned inside, she found Taza mending her latch with careful hands, his movements precise, unhurried, as though the cabin were already his to protect. Chenoa stirred by the hearth, whispering again to the child inside her, her song tender and hushed. Martha watched, torn between warmth and dread. The cabin felt alive, filled with breath and voices not her own, yet each moment pushed her closer to the jaws of gossip that had stalked her for years. By midday, she rode the old mule down into town, bundled in her gray shawl, face set to stillness. She had to fetch flour and lamp oil, things she could not do without. But as soon as she tethered her mule outside the mercantile, she sensed it. Eyes turning, lips tightening. A pair of children paused their play, staring, before their mother tugged them away with a whisper too low for Martha to hear, though she knew its shape. She had lived long enough among whispers to know their tone. Inside, the store smelled of coffee grounds and leather. Eleanor Briggs stood by the counter, a woman of 40, whose eyes carried the gleam of cruelty disguised as piety. She greeted Martha with a thin smile. "Well, if it isn't our hermit come down from the hills," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Braved the storm all alone, did you?" Martha kept her hands steady as she selected flour, though her chest tightened. "As I always do." Eleanor's smile sharpened. "Funny thing. Sheriff Amos says he saw smoke late into the night. Said it looked as though you had company." A pause lingered, sweet and cruel. Imagine that. After all these years. The room hushed. A ranch hand shifted near the barrels of oats. The clerk cleared his throat but said nothing. Martha felt the weight of every gaze. She willed her voice not to tremble. "I keep my fire as I please. The cold doesn't ask permission." Eleanor tilted her head, eyes glinting. "Of course. But tracks in snow tell stories, don't they? 2 sets, heavy, not your own. Makes a body wonder." Martha gathered her goods, her heart pounding in her ears. She gave no reply, but silence itself became confession in their minds. She walked out into the pale noon, each step down the wooden porch like a bell tolling. The wind carried the echo of their whispers behind her, words not spoken aloud but planted all the same. "She hides something. She is not one of us." The ride home was longer than it should have been. She clutched the reins, her jaw tight, her eyes stinging from wind and shame. By the time she reached her cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney looked almost accusatory. She dismounted, hands numb, and pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth struck her like a confession. Taza looked up from where he worked binding wood into braces for her sagging roof beam. His expression did not change, yet his eyes carried a question she had no words to answer. Chenoa rose slowly, smiling faintly, her hand resting against her belly. For a moment, Martha felt the clash of 2 worlds. Outside, judgment sharp as ice. Inside, warmth fragile as breath. She set the flour on the shelf and stood still, fighting tears she would not allow. "They know," she whispered at last. Her voice broke on the words. Chenoa tilted her head, not fully grasping, but the tremor in Martha's tone spoke enough. Taza straightened, his broad frame shadowing the firelight. He placed his hand over his chest, then pointed toward the window where snow pressed against the glass, his meaning clear. If danger came, he would meet it. That night, Martha lay in her cot listening to the fire sigh low. Across the room, Chenoa whispered in her sleep, words curling like smoke. Taza's shadow lingered at the window, unmoving, a sentinel carved of silence. Martha stared at the rafters, hearing the phantom voices of the town. She felt shame, not for what she had done, but for how little strength she believed she had left to fight them. Yet beneath that shame, something else stirred. A spark, fragile but real. She had lied to the sheriff the night before. She had withstood Eleanor's cruelty without breaking. For a woman scorned for years, even defiance in silence was a revolution. The next day, Taza took axe to woodpile, each strike ringing through the frozen air. The rhythm of it seemed to declare his presence, bold, unafraid. Martha's heart pounded each time the sound echoed through the trees, certain it would carry down the valley to ears waiting for proof. She wanted to hush him, to beg him to be invisible, but part of her marveled at his refusal. He lived without apology, where she had bent her spine to gossip for decades. Chenoa joined Martha in the chores, moving slowly, humming as she folded worn linens. At one point, she touched Martha's hand lightly, a gesture so simple it startled her. Their eyes met, and in that look Martha saw kinship. Two women, both cast aside in different ways, both building something fragile together in defiance of the world's cruelty. That evening, as the storm settled into quiet flurries, Martha stepped outside to fetch more wood. She paused, hearing the crunch of hooves in the distance. Peering down the white valley, she saw a dark figure on horseback. Sheriff Amos. He sat still for a long moment, studying the cabin, smoke rising from its chimney, before turning his horse back toward town. Martha's stomach twisted. She knew what his watch meant. Word would spread faster now. There would be no keeping secrets much longer. When she went back inside, the cabin felt too warm, too alive. She looked at Chenoa, who smiled faintly through her weariness, and at Taza, whose gaze never wavered from hers. She realized then what the town feared was not savages in the hills but change itself. Change that began quietly, in one woman's cabin, in the simplest act of shelter. She closed the door against the snow and leaned her back to it, her breath ragged. The hush inside seemed to deepen. A life once silent was now tied to others, bound by choice, by danger, by something she could not name. And as the fire spat sparks and the storm whispered against the walls, Martha knew with a shiver of certainty. Before many days passed, she would have to stand before the town and claim her choice, or watch them destroy it. The days lengthened into a brittle quiet, each one carrying a weight heavier than the snow that smothered the pines. Martha moved through her cabin like a woman suspended between two worlds. Inside, the warmth of fire and companionship; outside, the cold gaze of a town sharpening its suspicions. She felt it in the air, though no messenger came. Taza's axe still rang against the woodpile, each strike echoing with fearless steadiness. Chenoa's voice still carried soft lullabies into the rafters, her hands brushing linens or smoothing her rounded belly. Yet beneath it all, Martha heard the slow tightening of a noose woven by whispers. One afternoon, she ventured again to town for salt and lye soap. The snow had eased, leaving the streets slush-streaked, mud beneath beginning to thaw. As she tied her mule outside the mercantile, voices drifted to her from the porch of the saloon across the way. "She's hiding something, sure as the sky's blue," Eleanor Briggs declared, her shawl pulled close, her eyes bright with venom. "Smoke never quits up there, and Amos saw prints by her door, man's boots, heavier than hers. And don't tell me a suitor's come calling, not after all these years." The men laughed harshly, but one spat in the street. "If it's Indians, like you say, then it's trouble waiting to happen. We can't have redskins nestled close." Martha stiffened. Her cheeks burned though the air was cold. She forced herself inside the mercantile, but every step felt dragged by invisible chains. When she left with her small parcel, Eleanor's gaze met hers across the street, gloating, certain. Martha kept her eyes low, but inside, shame clawed at her ribs. Back at the cabin, she set the parcel down harder than she meant to. Chenoa looked up from her seat by the fire, dark eyes searching Martha's face. Martha shook her head, unable to speak, but Chenoa rose slowly, her body heavy with child, and crossed the room. Without words, she touched Martha's hand, warm against her frozen skin. Martha's throat closed, her shame melting into something more fragile. Gratitude, unbearable in its tenderness. That night when the wind hushed, Martha and Chenoa sat close by the hearth. Chenoa, with halting words, confessed that her own people had turned from her. Her tribe rejecting her for choosing Taza, for crossing boundaries of custom. Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with remembered loneliness. Martha listened, struck by the mirror of their lives. Two women cast aside, not for sins but for choices others judged unforgivable. A bond grew in the quiet between their breaths, unspoken but strong. Later, Martha brushed her hair before bed, the strands silver-white in the firelight. She felt Chenoa's gaze and lowered her eyes, ashamed of her aging reflection. But then Chenoa reached out, her hand brushing the pale strands with reverence, whispering something in Apache, a word Martha did not know yet somehow understood. Beautiful. Tears stung her eyes. She had not been called such in decades. The following morning, hoofbeats cracked across the frozen earth. Martha peered through the shutters, her breath stalling. Sheriff Amos Blackwood rode at the head of 4 men, rifles resting casual across their saddles. Their faces were drawn with suspicion, mouths set like stone. They stopped near her gate, steam rising from the horses. Amos dismounted, boots crunching snow. He called out, his voice carrying, "Martha Whitlow, come out." Her heart hammered. Behind her, Taza rose, silent as always, broad shoulders squared. His eyes met hers, steady, awaiting her choice. Martha swallowed hard, then pushed the door open and stepped into the frigid air. "What business brings you here, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice steady though her knees threatened to buckle. Amos studied her with hard eyes. "We've had word. Indians seen near. Some say they're holed up here. I need to know who keeps your fire burning so hot all hours." His gaze slid to the smoke curling from her chimney. Martha felt the men's eyes pierce her, suspicion thick enough to choke. She thought of lying again, but the weight of it pressed heavy. She straightened her spine, feeling the cold bite her skin. "This is my home. My fire burns as I see fit." Amos narrowed his eyes. "You won't mind us having a look then?" Inside the cabin, Taza's hand tightened on the doorframe. Martha saw him, saw Chenoa pale and trembling, clutching her belly. Something fierce surged in her chest, fierce and new. She stepped forward, blocking the sheriff's way. "You won't step inside my door, Amos Blackwood," she said. Her voice rang sharper than she knew she possessed. "Not tonight. Not ever without cause." The men shifted in their saddles, muttering. Amos stared long, his jaw tight. Then he spat into the snow. "You've grown bold, Martha. Boldness cuts both ways. Best remember the town's patience is thin." He turned, mounted his horse and rode off, his men trailing like shadows. When the sound of hooves faded, Martha collapsed against the doorframe, her breath ragged. Taza's hand touched her shoulder. Just a brush, nothing more. Yet in that touch was recognition, respect, and something that steadied her more than any words could. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, hearing every groan of timber, every sigh of wind. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it stirred a fragile pride. She had stood against Amos. She had spoken without trembling. For the first time in years, her voice had carried weight. By the fire's glow, she watched Taza seated near the door, his eyes open in the dark, always watching. Chenoa slept fitfully, murmuring in her dreams. Martha's chest ached with something she could not name. She was no longer only herself, their lives were bound with hers now. In the hours before dawn, a silence deeper than any storm settled. Martha rose to fetch more wood, but when she cracked the door open, she froze. Down the valley, torches flickered against the snow, a line of riders moving slow but certain, their light cutting the darkness like knives. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no patrol. This was the town coming in force. She closed the door gently, her hand trembling on the latch. The fire glowed behind her, but she felt the cold seep deep into her bones. She looked at Taza, at Chenoa stirring in uneasy sleep, and knew the storm outside had finally broken into threat. And for the first time, she realized the fight ahead would not be about whispers, but survival. The torches drew closer, their light scattering across the snow like shards of fire. Martha stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had imagined this moment in fragments, gossip hardening into confrontation, suspicion becoming accusation, but never had she pictured the full weight of it. Men riding with rifles slung across their shoulders, faces carved of judgment, voices prepared to condemn. Her cabin, once the tomb of her solitude, now held more life than it had in decades, and that life was in peril. Taza rose silently, the fire's glow painting his bare chest in bronze. He strapped the knife at his side, though he knew it was nothing against guns. His eyes flicked toward Chenoa, who struggled to rise, her face pale, her body heavy with the nearness of birth. Martha moved quickly to her side, easing her back down. "Stay," she whispered, her voice shaking. Chenoa's fingers clutched hers, wordless, pleading for something Martha did not know if she possessed. The hoofbeats grew louder, crunching in rhythm across the frozen earth until the torches stopped at the gate. Sheriff Amos's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "Martha Whitlow, open your door." We'll have the truth this night." The men murmured agreement, their impatience carried on the wind. Martha felt Taza's gaze upon her, steady and unyielding. In that look was no command, only a question. Would she stand, or would she break? She thought of her years bowed beneath whispers, her silence mistaken for shame. She thought of the kindness of Chenoa's touch, of Taza's quiet labor, of the firelit nights when her home no longer felt like a coffin. Something inside her, long dormant, rose like a tide. She unlatched the door and stepped into the snow. The cold seized her breath, but she held her head high, her white hair streaming loose around her shoulders. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles as she faced them, a lone figure against the storm. Amos dismounted, his torch spitting sparks into the dark. "You've had your chance to answer plain," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We know who you shelter. Hand them over, or the town will see justice done." Martha's voice cut through the night, steady as iron. "This is my home. My fire burns for those I choose to protect. You'll not take them from me." The men muttered, their rifles lifting, but in that moment the cabin door opened behind her. Taza stepped into the light, shirtless still, his breath steaming in the freezing air. He carried no weapon, but his presence, tall and unflinching, was weapon enough. He moved to Martha's side, not in front of her but beside her, as though acknowledging her claim. The torches flickered in the wind, their glow painting the snow crimson and gold. Amos's face hardened. "You defy your own people for them?" Martha's answer came without hesitation. "For years you called me nothing, a ghost in these hills. Tonight, I claim myself. Judge me if you dare." Her voice rang across the valley, louder than she thought possible, carried by a strength that had lain hidden beneath decades of silence. The rifles wavered. Some of the men shifted in their saddles, doubt shadowing their eyes. What they had expected, a cowering woman, a savage lurking in her doorway, was not what stood before them. Instead, they saw a woman who had chosen her place, her dignity, and stood unbowed against their judgment. Amos's jaw tightened, but his hand hesitated at his holster. The storm howled around them, snow cutting sideways, and for a long moment the night held its breath. Then a cry pierced the air, not of anger but of life. From inside the cabin, Chenoa's voice broke into a wail of labor. The sound froze the men where they stood. It was raw, undeniable, the sound of birth demanding witness. Martha turned sharply, fear and urgency flooding her veins. She rushed back inside, the warmth striking her face as she fell to Chenoa's side. The young woman clutched her hand, sweat beading her brow despite the cold. Her eyes locked on Martha's, desperate yet trusting. Martha knelt, her hands steady where her heart raced. Taza crouched on the other side, his silence breaking in a hoarse whisper to his wife, words Martha could not understand but felt like prayer. Outside, the men stirred, restless, but the cries from within the cabin carried through the cracks of wood, stripping away their certainty. They were not facing raiders, not savages, but a woman birthing new life beneath the roof of a woman they had called outcast. The torches hissed in the snow, the rifles lowered. Hours seemed to compress into moments. With Martha's hands guiding, with Chenoa's strength surging, with Taza's steady presence anchoring, the child came. A thin cry pierced the cabin, fragile yet fierce, echoing like a bell through the rafters. Martha lifted the newborn, slick and trembling, and laid him against his mother's chest. Chenoa wept, her dark eyes luminous, whispering the baby's name in a tongue Martha did not know. Taza pressed his forehead to theirs, his broad shoulders shuddering with relief. Martha's own eyes blurred. She had never held a child of her own, never felt the raw miracle of life's beginning. Yet here she was, her hands the bridge between despair and survival. For the first time in years, her heart beat not in solitude but in rhythm with others. The storm eased by dawn. When Martha stepped outside again, exhausted yet upright, the valley lay hushed beneath a sky washed pale with morning. The torches were gone. The riders had retreated in silence, leaving only tracks in the snow. Whether out of shame or awe, she did not know, but they had not returned to press their judgment. She breathed deeply, the air sharp and cold, her lungs burning with life. Behind her, the sound of a newborn's cry wove into the crackle of fire, into the steady breath of a house reborn. Taza's gaze met hers through the doorway, filled with gratitude unspoken but deep as the earth. Martha looked out across the hills, where once she had felt only emptiness. She thought of the years stolen by silence, of the shame piled upon her by others' tongues. And she thought of the choice she had made, to open her door, to stand her ground, to claim her worth not by their measure but her own. Her voice, soft yet sure, rose into the dawn as if speaking to those who might still judge, or to the memory of her younger self. Dignity comes when you decide it does. Not when they give it to you. The snow fell gentle, like grace returning,